So welcome to FinFest USA's first February webinar. My name is Helena Halmari. I'm your moderator from Sam Houston State University. Thank you all for joining us for February's first webinar on multilingual Finland. The co-organizer of these two panels on multilingual Finland is Lotta Wexström from University of California, Berkeley. We start our multilingual Finland panels today by two topics, Finnish and Finland Swedish in Finland. As our panelists, we have Johanna Laakso and Jan-Ola Östman. Johanna is from University of Vienna, Austria, but speaking from Finland, right? And yes. Jan-Ola Östman from University of Helsinki, but speaking from Uppsala, Sweden. So this is an international event. Next Saturday, February 26th, we will continue the multilingual Finland theme. We'll hear presentations by more experts on more of Finland's languages. There's no way we can cover them all, but we will cover Sami, Romani, Karelian, Russian, Estonian, and African languages, some African languages in Finland today. Next Saturday's webinar will be a full 2-hour webinar because we have 4 presenters, and please sign up and register and come to hear. Today, Professor Laakso and Professor Östman will both present a 20-minute lecture, or give or take somewhere, not to the minute. After both of these talks, we will have a question and answer session. So start typing up your questions in the Q&A, even while our lecturers are speaking. We have reserved 90 minutes for this webinar, but we can also use a little bit more, up to 2 hours, if you have a lot of questions. So you can start entering your questions, but they will be presented by me as the moderator to our experts after both of the talks. FinFest USA has also asked our panelists to provide a list of resources in case anyone is wondering where can I learn more on these topics. These resource lists will be posted on FinFest USA's website. So we thank our panelists for that service as well. Today's event is recorded, and the recording will be available soon on FinFest USA's website. Your donations make it possible for FinFest USA to continue to offer these events. So all donations will be received with gratitude by FinFest USA. And I will now briefly introduce our panelists, Dr. Johanna Laakso and Dr. Jan-Ola Östman. Both are internationally known scholars. Johanna Laakso from University of Vienna received her PhD from University of Helsinki, but since 2000 she has held the chair. I hope that was correct. Okay, but since 2000 she has held the chair of Finno-Ugric Studies at the University of Vienna, Austria. Her field is historical linguistics, and she has investigated questions of minority languages and language contacts, as well as the relationship of language and gender. And her CV is very long, so she's published a lot. And her topic today is everything you ever heard about the Finnish language might be wrong. A quick introduction into a perfectly ordinary European language. So we look forward to that. And I will also, in order to have a smooth sequence of both of the talks, I will introduce our second speaker also at this point. Professor Jan-Ola Östman is from University of Helsinki. He retired from there, so he's professor emeritus, and he had a professorship at University of Helsinki in Scandinavian languages. And he received his doctorate in linguistics from University of California, Berkeley, and he has mostly worked on the role of language and power in society, with a specific interest in minority languages from different perspectives. He grew up in the Swedish language village of Sulf in Ostrobothnia in Finland, and his dissertation also dealt with aspects of the dialect spoken in that village. And today, Dr. Östman will present on the past, present, and future of Swedish in Finland. We look forward to that after Dr. Laakso's presentation. So thank you for both panelists for being here today and providing your expertise. And I will now give the floor to Johanna Laakso from University of Vienna, and she will address Finnish.
Okay, I hope you can see my presentation now, and I hope you can see it also in the presentation mode. So, welcome everybody, and Helena, many thanks for this invitation. I'm trying to be brief and face bravely this mission impossible of telling you everything about the Finnish language in 20 minutes. Let's see how well I can manage with it. So, why I have given this presentation such a funny title is, well, because my starting point here is that not only foreigners, but also Finns themselves often have this idea that Finnish is something very exceptional, a very weird, a very exotic language. And this is also based on the average Western layperson's idea of languages. People in Western Europe and North America, at least, very often seem to think that there are normal languages like English and perhaps some other languages like French and German or Spanish, which a normal person maybe has learned somewhere. And then there are absolutely weird languages, which nobody can be expected to master, really. The normal languages have been there since time immemorial. It's not really interesting how they came there because they have always been there. The weird languages are so weird, they must have come from somewhere else. Normal languages change, but the weird languages are very ancient and they haven't changed at all since some certain point in history. And the normal languages are spoken by normal Western people, and weird languages are spoken by weird exotic people who have that special sense of snow or something like that because they have a zillion words for something. And these myths are often shared, as for the Finnish language, also by the Finns themselves. So this is why this presentation has some kind of a myth-busting character. So starting with why Finnish is so weird, it is because it is not related to the major languages of Europe, but as any Finn will tell you, it's related to other Finno-Ugric or Uralic languages, which are spoken in Estonia, in Hungary and neighboring areas. And then there are lots of languages about which an average Western layperson has never heard. And most of these languages are spoken in Russia. It's actually quite interesting. By learning Finno-Ugric studies, we also learn that Russia is not just Russian speaking and not just Russian, but there are very many minority languages and nations there. Okay, but what does being related really mean? This is a very standard illustration. You will see things like that in so roughly any introduction to historical linguistics. Related languages are related because they descend from something called a proto-language. It might not be documented, it's just reconstructed. This is what these stars here mean. And in our case, it's called Proto-Uralic. And here are some example words in some Uralic languages of today. And these are typically so-called basic vocabulary, that is words like small numerals or body part terms, or some basic verbs. And what you can see here is first, not necessarily all these words are present everywhere. Words are lost and replaced, like Mordvin has lost the ancient word for go, which is present everywhere in all other languages. And these are not necessarily very similar. You can't see without, at first glance, that Finnish kaksi and Ninets shija are related. You need some historical linguistic expertise to be able to tell that. And this is not just the Uralic language family. These are the same methods have been applied to many other language families of the world as well. And here are some examples from the Indo-European language family, which is this major family of languages to which most European languages like English and many other languages belong. And you see the same thing. These words are different. English too is really the same word as Armenian erko. You wouldn't believe it, but it's true. And sometimes words get lost and are replaced. So basically what this relatedness thing is about, that it's all languages change with time, and given enough time, they may change really a lot and become completely different. And also languages change, but populations change too. And populations do not change necessarily the same way as languages, because languages and genes are not always transmitted together. And this means that speakers of very distantly related languages often have very different looks and different cultures and traditions. Just think of speakers of Swedish and speakers of Hindi in India, or Finns and Hungarians for that matter. This means that we can speak about populations and we can speak about languages, but they are two different stories. And speaking of the Finns, this usual question, when did the Finns come to Finland? From where did the Finns come? Is absurd, because the Finns never came to Finland, because there never have been Finns outside Finland. The Finnish nation of today developed from different populations coming from different directions. Some 9,000 years ago, towards the end of the Ice Age, this area was covered by a huge ice layer. And when it started to melt, first different populations came from different directions, probably speaking languages of which we know very little or practically nothing. And this reconstructed Proto-Uralic language was probably spoken here somewhere in today's Russia and started spreading westwards sometime in the Bronze Age. In today's Finland, first, probably it was in prehistoric times, it was multilingual already by those times. So there were probably many ancient extinct languages, these unknown Paleo-European languages spoken in Finland. But at some point in the Iron Age, most of them were replaced by languages of a Sami type. Today's Sami languages are spoken here in the northernmost parts of Fennoscandia, but probably at some point, practically all of today's Finland was Sami speaking. And the dialects that became the Finnish language started spreading in the inland of today's Finland sometime in the second half of the first millennium. And so we are speaking of the Finnic language group, which was originally something like a continuum of dialects on all sides of the Gulf of Finland, that is this here between today's Finland and today's Estonia. And it was probably a pretty smooth and continuous continuum, and which was split by political borders in the Middle Ages, that is starting from the 13th century or so. And the part that became Finland became gradually a part of the emerging Kingdom of Sweden. And this map shows the Finnic languages, not in those times, but at the beginning of the 20th century, before the First World War and before all the catastrophes of the 20th century. So all these bluish and grayish shades, bluish and green shades here are Finnish, different dialects of Finnish. And you see also these areas here, the traditional Swedish-speaking areas. Jan-Ola will tell you more about that. And here in the north, the Sami-speaking area. But in any case, in the Middle Ages, there was nothing like a Finnish language. It was a continuum of dialects here, which became part of the Swedish area. And the Finnish language actually comes into the picture in the 16th century. If we need to give some certain point of time, the name Finland or Suomi originally referred to the southwestern part of today's Finland. That is where Turku, the old capital of Finland, so to say, is located. And in the 16th century, when a written language was created for Finnish, as part of the Protestant Reformation, it was explicitly written in the first Finnish translation of the New Testament, in the preface to it, that there are many languages and ways of speaking in this country, but for various reasons in this book, the Finnish language is used. And by Finnish language, Mikael Agricola meant the dialect of the Turku region, the southwestern part of Finland. From this beginning, the idea of there being a Finnish language common to all this whole area started to develop and emerge. The written language existed mainly as a church language. So the people, of course, went on speaking their dialects as they had spoken for generations and generations. The church used this written language to communicate with the people for teaching and preaching. But otherwise, in Finland, as part of Sweden, Swedish was the language of administration and education. And this Swedish was really the prestige language too. And actually, some historians have quite seriously asked, why has Finnish survived? Or why didn't the same thing happen as in Ireland, where Irish today is a language spoken by pretty few people so actively, and a language which is cultivated rather for sentimental and nationalist reasons. So why didn't the same thing happen with Finnish? Even in the mid-19th century, many Finns were still shifting to Swedish. There were complicated historical reasons for this. To put it very, very briefly, in 1809, Finland was detached from Sweden and attached to the Russian Empire as an autonomous unit. The autonomy means that Finland maintained the old Swedish laws and Swedish as the language of administration and education. And in those times, so Finland had become a political unit in itself. And in those times, in the 19th century, that was the time of romantic nationalism in many other parts of Europe too. Languages were revitalized or created or emancipated. And this took place in Finland too, within actually just a few decades. Finnish, which had been mainly the spoken language of uneducated people, was developed into a full-scale language with a literature and press. Here's an illustration. One of the first newspapers in Finnish language that appeared. There were many newspapers already by that time, and a language which could be used really in education and literature and administration. And so, of course, this needed language planning. So today's Finnish standard Finnish language was created and standardized, combining features from various dialects, which means also that today's standard Finnish is something like an artificial language. Combination of features from different dialects and with some completely artificial solutions, and a language which, so to say, nobody really speaks, which is one of the reasons why there is a huge difference in Finnish even today between the written language and the spoken colloquial language. Okay, but the language was also developed by enhancing the vocabulary. Hundreds of new words were devised for all these modern things. In Western Europe, old major languages like English and French have these vocabulary mainly. They come from Latin. These words come from Latin or Greek or from French or from other major languages. In Finland, for the Finnish language, these words were often developed consciously for this purpose from derived or using dialect words or making compounds. And so Finnish became a national language, which came to be used as a full-scale national language in the new Republic of Finland, which became independent in 1917. So now we have Finnish as one of the major languages of the world, so to say, which means that in worldwide comparison, actually, Finnish is not a small language. You will hear from your Finnish friends pretty often that Finnish is such a small language and such an unimportant language. Actually, if we take a look at all the languages worldwide, there are some perhaps 6,000 or 7,000 languages in the world, and most of these languages are quite small. And in comparison to them, Finnish is really not that small, with more than 5 million speakers. It is more speakers than 98% of the world's languages. Finnish is very much used on the internet. It's among the 30 most used languages on the internet. And there are not that many languages in the whole world in which newspapers appear regularly, and Finnish is one of them. So Finnish is not that small. And Finnish, of course, is spoken on everywhere in the world. In the neighboring areas, there are old Finnish minorities, so to say. This border between Finland and Sweden, which was drawn in 1809, was not a natural cultural language border. And on the Swedish side, there remained a few thousand Finnish speakers. Their traditional language is now cultivated and acknowledged in Sweden as a national minority language under the name meänkieli, which means our language. In more southern parts of Sweden and Norway, there were so-called forest Finns. Their language is now extinct. In Ingria, here near St. Petersburg, there were Finns who had mostly moved there in the 17th century from the southeastern parts of Finland at that times. And on the northern coasts of Norway, there are the Kvens, people whose ancestors have moved probably from these areas in the far north of the Finnish language area. But there has also, of course, been a huge emigration from Finland to different countries throughout times, to North America, to South America, and especially to Sweden, especially in the 1960s and 70s. There was really a massive emigration. Now, these are total sums of immigrants, and not all of them were Finnish speakers, by the way. Especially in this emigration to Sweden, the Swedish-speaking minority of Finland was very strongly represented. Nevertheless, so there are Finnish diasporas all over the world. And there are linguists who use expressions like world Finnishes. So the Finnish language already exists in different varieties and spoken not only by people who were born in Finland and have lived in Finland and who have learned Finnish as their first language. Okay, so now I hope I still have some time to tell you something about the structure of the Finnish language itself, very, very quickly, a very fast introduction. So Finnish is not that complicated and not that exotic. Just a few examples here. Finnish has a very consistent and phonological spelling. There is one letter for each sound and 2 letters for long sounds, which is quite essential because in Finnish or in the Finnish languages in general, it makes a difference whether a sound is short or long. So tule is different from tulee, tulle, tuule, tulle, or ei tule. Otherwise, the sounds of Finnish are not that exotic. So exotic or rare sounds, which only occur in a few languages, they are absent here. Finnish is a pretty normal European language in this respect. You might have heard these horror stories about the Finnish grammar. This is something which keeps circulating in my social media bubble. Every 2 months or 3 months, somebody is posting this. A long story. This is just a part of it. We have the Swedish language discussing with English about how Swedish has so many different inflectional forms. We have basic forms and definite forms for each word, and in singular and in plural. Then comes the German language, which of course has much more inflectional forms. And then comes Finland ball, joining conversation and starts producing the different inflectional forms for the word koira, dog. And so you can find this story on the internet if you want to read it. It's a very nice illustration of this typical misconception that Finnish is so incredibly synthetic and has such an incredible amount of different inflectional forms. No, Finnish is not that synthetic as language typologists call it. There are many languages around the world which are much more synthetic. And these long word forms in Finnish are usually clearly segmentable. You can divide them in parts and derive the meaning from their parts. So koiralleni, to my dog, actually has elements corresponding to dog, to, and my, just in a different order and written together, but it's not no more complex. And there are some plus points too. I'm coming to them very soon, but first, as you saw already, Finnish is a pretty normal European language. The word order is of the usual Western European subject, verb, object type. Unlike most other Uralic languages in which the verb very often comes after the object, so they like Yoda speak, but Finns don't. Finnish has the syntax, the structure of sentences is very Western European. We have conjunctions for subordinate clauses. We have relative pronouns like Western European languages have, and unlike the easternmost Uralic languages. The system of tenses is completely Germanic. And of course, this is not a coincidence, but Finnish is has been really strongly influenced by the neighboring Indo-European and in particular Germanic languages. Of course, there are some features which are perhaps more exotic, but this misconception also, which Finns themselves like to share, also comes from the fact that, Finns typically only know major Western Indo-European languages, which are all related. The grammatical gender is a good example. Actually, only a minority of the world's languages has grammatical genders or gendered pronouns like he and she. Finnish patterns with the majority of the world's languages. It's just that typical Finns usually don't know these other languages. Finnish doesn't have a verb, but possession is expressed with so-called locational coding, but this is also how very many languages of the world do it. Actually, languages with a have a verb are something like, I believe, 1/4 of the languages of the world or so have this kind of constructions. Or the negation in Finnish is a little bit exotic in that the word for no is a verb inflected in person. So she sings, she doesn't sing, and I don't sing, and you guys don't sing. We have different no words here. But this isn't that rare either. It's, I believe, something like almost 10% of the languages of the world are doing the negation this way too. What is really strange about Finnish is probably that the words don't resemble anything else. So when you start studying Finnish, it's just burdens your memory, memorizing these completely different words. But actually, even these different words include quite a few old friends in disguise. So Finnish has very many loan words from Indo-European languages. Some of them are really old and have come to the English language via other Indo-European languages. Some of them come from the Baltic languages, which gave quite a few words into Proto-Finnic, and very many of them are Germanic, either from a very old variety of Germanic spoken somewhere in the circum-Baltic areas at a time when languages like Finnish or Swedish or German didn't exist yet. So there's an earlier time level. And the most recent loanwords come from Swedish or Low German, and many of these words also appear in English, for instance. So to sum up, Finnish is not an ancient language. No language is ancient, all languages change. Finnish is quite conservative in some respects, but not all. Finnish is definitely not a small language, and Finnish is not the language that came in from the cold, as you can say, and Finnish is not exceptionally complicated or exceptionally difficult. And what is really interesting about this whole matter is what keeps the myths about Finnish alive, why there are still so many Finns who want to believe that Finnish is quite exceptional and so really very, very complicated and difficult and impossible to learn. Some parts of it, some part of the explanation here, of course, the general ignorance. An average Western layperson knows very little about linguistics, actually, or language typology for that matter, or of the smaller languages of the world. The legacy of Romantic nationalism, combined with the so-called Worfian thinking that is language equals ethnicity, and there's a sense culture, and language determines your worldview, and everything belongs together. No, it's not so, but we want to believe it. We want to see this so. And finally, it's something like a cultural self-colonization or cultural self-othering. Finns are really so infatuated with this idea of being completely different, and the language being completely being so complicated and so different and so exotic. And so this is something which we could perhaps also discuss if there is still time, but now I must stop. Many thanks to all of you for bearing with me.
Thank you so much, Johanna. This was fantastic. Thank you. We'll save the questions after we have heard the second lecture. So at this point, we'll just move on to Jan-Ola Östman's presentation on Swedish in Finland today.
Okay, thank you so very much, Johanna. I hope you can hear me. Johanna is definitely the expert on historical aspects of language and on Finnish. And my talk will be very different, but I'm very happy that you gave this lecture. I'm going to talk really about what's happening at the moment, and I kind of take for granted that you know what Swedish is. Maybe I shouldn't do that, but I'm going to talk about the past, present, and future of Swedish in Finland, according to my what I've said I should talk about. And now I'm just going to see how I get to the next one. Okay, I'm one of the Finland Swedes, and as Helena already said, I come from a small village in Finland. Here you see a map of Finland, of course, and here you see the Swedish parts, or the Finland Swedish parts of Sweden, where Swedish is mostly spoken in the traditionally. And this is where I come from. There's a town of Vasa, and there's a little village called Sorv, and that's where I come from. And this is the Ostrobotnian area. And the interesting thing with this part of the world, or Finland, is that some 500 million years ago, there was a meteorite that hit the area. This is Vasa, the area, and this is Sorv. And that created a very good farmland, also because there is this thing in the area where the land uplift is about 1 meter per 100 years. So I come from this small village. My parents were small-scale farmers, and they only speak or spoke the Salt dialect, knew no Finnish, and hardly any standard Swedish. And when you come from an area like that, I mean, I had not even heard Finnish spoken until I was maybe 10 or so. But then in order to get a job and well, also at school, you had to sort of learn Finnish. I mean, you had to, and it was a language that you never heard. And I remember that I was about 18 years old when I first had to even use Finnish. That may sound a little bit weird if you're from Finland. But then again, when you want a job, as I did at the university, you had to have a certificate or saying that you have total knowledge of Finnish in order to get a job at the university. And so that was a lot of challenges for people who had never heard Finnish before, and I presume it still is. And also that's why Johanna said that a lot of the Swedish speakers moved to Sweden. At the moment, I have some kids. 2 of them have Finnish as the stronger language. 1 has Swedish, and 2 are very bilingual. So at the moment, the 2 languages, Finnish and Swedish, are there in parallel, at least even in my family. I made this slide also because we do talk about Finland Swedish. I know there are some people who feel that Finland Swedish is not really correct English, but as you all know, or as you should know, that it is the community, the people themselves who can say what they want to be called. And we want to be called Finland Swedes, not Finno Swedish or Finnish Swedish or anything, Finland Swedes. In Sweden, we have Sweden Swedish, and we talk about Swedish language Finland. And that's the areas then in Finland where Finland Swedes have of tradition lived and still live. There is also something called Finland Swedish Sign Language. Finland Swedes who use sign language use the Finland Swedish Sign Language as their L1. And the reason I'm saying that is because when you talk about what a Finland Swede is, you have the Swedish speaking Finns, you have the Finland Swedish Sign Language users, and then you have people who have registered themselves as Swedish, because in Finland you do have to register your L1 or your mother tongue or whatever you call it. And so it's not only, Finland is not only Swedish speaking Finland, it's Swedish language Finland, because there are quite a lot of, sorry, this is a small point, but I think it's important. And that is of course different from then the Sweden Finns who live in Sweden that Johanna also talked about. And we have Finland Swedes in Sweden also, as you heard. Now, I also felt that it was important to point out that Finland Swedes have very different backgrounds. We have all the small-scale farmers that settled in rural areas like my parents and people on the West Coast and in the Southwest. And well, it's unclear when my ancestors came to Finland, but at least I can go back to the 1600s. And I'm not going to, talk about the other things about how to when Swedes came to Finland or anything like that. Johanna knows more about that. But there are also lots of other people, entrepreneurs, administrators, priests, teachers, whatever. And so, as we know, there were lots of people, well, I'll come back to that a little bit, but there were, of course, Finland was part of Sweden, or what is today known as Finland was part of Sweden for a long time. But I wanted to say something about farming, because that's where I come from. And basically you have a kind of slash and burn technique in the inland, whereas then farming was more popular in the coastal areas. And so you were actually having quite a lot of contacts with Finnish speakers in all spheres of life. Also where I come from, where people traditionally think, well, there's always been Swedish speakers there and they've never had any contacts with the Finnish speakers. But the Finns would come over and do a lot of seal hunting and stuff, and they would live for months out there in the areas where the Swedish speakers were. And I'm sure they had quite a lot of contact. And you can see that in the dialects also, that there's a lot of words that have come from Finnish. So I think the two groups have always sort of been in contact. Politically, there's the Swedish People's Party who try to have as their main thing to sort of see to it that the Swedish language population gets seen or taken care of in sort of political issues also. He's just basically saying the same thing as Johanna said, I know that the forest Finns are not the sort of people in Värmland now, but I've done quite a lot of field work there. And there are a lot of people in Sweden, in Värmland, who still feel very close to the old forest Finns and even talk about themselves as that. And also it's important to know that it's not only so that there was a lot of Swedish in Finland, but there was also a lot of Finnish all over the place in Sweden. So if you go back and look at theatrical dramas and so forth in Stockholm, you see that there's a lot of characters in the theatrical performances that spoke Finnish, even in the 1600s and so forth. So to me, Finnish and Swedish was sort of used on both sides of the Gulf of Bothnia. As Johanna said, Finland became part of the Grand Duchy of, or became a Grand Duchy of Russia, and then declared its independence with two national languages, that is Finnish and Swedish. And well, there's some maps over there, but there were quite a lot of contacts between Finland Swedes and Sweden Swedes in the 19th century. And it's not only, Johanna said that there were many Finns who changed their languages to Swedish, but there were also quite a lot of people quite a lot of Swedish speakers who changed their language and their names to Swedish, to Finnish names, because all in the interest of the national romanticism, because you wanted also to the other, the people or the world outside to see that this is one community, this is one language, this is one folk, and that's good to have if you want independence. But then at the end of the 19th century, Russification set in, or attempts at Russification set in, especially when Nikolai II became Tsar. And that also meant that the connection to Sweden was not as easily kept up as it had been so far. And that means also that Swedish in Finland had developed its own characteristic features, archaistic things, but also the legal system in Finnish gradually developed in a different direction, and then you needed different terms that you don't find in Swedish. Now, I'm not going to go through Sweden or Swedish or anything like that. There's a lot of stuff on Wikipedia, Google, and whatnot. There's also a thing that was produced a couple of years ago when Finland had its 100th birthday. In 1917, there were about 340,000 Swedish speakers of Finland Swedes in Finland. Nowadays, it's about 290,000, about 5%, sometimes a little bit more, maybe even a little bit less at some point. So the actual number of Swedish speakers in Finland hasn't changed drastically, but the percentage has changed, of course. Okay. Now there is one part between Finland and Sweden, that's the Åland Islands, that is semi-autonomous, and all the municipalities there are Swedish language municipalities, monolingual. And whereas there are no monolingual Swedish language municipalities in mainland Finland anymore, 33 of them are bilingual Finnish-Swedish municipalities. And the idea is that if you have a population that is more than 3,000, or if it's 8% or more of the population that has the other language, then it sort of has to be a bilingual municipality, which means that you have to offer services in both languages. A municipality can also self-select to be bilingual. Okay, Swedish then is a pluricentric language, as we say. That means that it has official status in 2 countries, in Sweden and Finland here. And it's the same language, just like American, British, Australian, and whatnot, English. And the peculiarities of Swedish in Finland is recorded, and it's included in the official dictionaries of Swedish. So it's not a sort of variety or a dialect that's a little bit on the side. It is part of the same language. And so you get a lot of information also now. Just a couple of days ago, they're revising the Språkriktighetsboken, which is the sort of book that says how you should speak. And they have, Finland Swedish has a prominent part in that too. There is even a Finland Swedish online course if you're interested, and that's being produced by people at the University of Helsinki, my colleagues. And also I should point out, of course, there's a lot of Swedish elsewhere, just like Johanna showed that there's a lot of Finnish elsewhere. And there was a considerable immigration to the USA around 1900 or before from Swedish language areas in Finland. My great-grandfather moved to the United States, and we never heard of him after that. So we presume that he, is not there anymore, or his ancestors. So there was a lot of that thing going on also on the Swedish parts of Finland. I have just mentioned here some of the characteristic traits of Finland Swedish in comparison to Sweden Swedish. There are, as I said, Finlandisms, but they are called words that are a little bit different, or that don't really work in both languages. The sort of intonation of the melody and the accents is something that we don't have in Finland Swedish. So in Sweden Swedish, you have to make a distinction between anden and anden, the duck and the spirit, the Holy Spirit. But here in Finland Swedish, if you pray to the Holy Spirit, you might just as well be praying to the duck. We don't make that distinction. So there are things like that. Certain sounds like the affricates, like church in Finland Swedish, but church in Sweden Swedish, and skör in Finland Swedish, and skör in Sweden Swedish, just to mimic what it would sound like. Manner of expression, I put in here aspects of politeness that Johanna also touched upon at the end about small talk, whereas in Finland you still use the second person plural to be polite, the ni, whereas in Swedish nobody uses ni, it's always du, you, the singular. And also directness is sort of borrowed from Finnish, I would say, in Finland Swedish, where people in Sweden are much more indirect. Here's just one funny example. This is the way you keep your fingers crossed, kind of thumbs up in Finland Swedish, but in Sweden Swedish you do it this way. So there are lots of, on all levels there are differences, but it's still the same language. And then we have Finnicisms, as we call them, direct borrowings from Finnish, especially in urban areas then with much contact with Finnish. you don't have to worry about this, but this is just to sort of give you an idea. Here in blue, you see the sort of standards Swedish, and you have a number of ways of expressing yourself or pronunciation. And then you have the Eastern Swedish dialects, and that's where Finland Swedish fits in together with Estonian Swedish and Ukrainian Swedish Gammelsvenska. So it's sort of one of the primary dialects of varieties of Swedish. I want to say a couple of things also about the use of the Swedish dialects in Finland, because up until about the 1980s, it wasn't acceptable to use dialect in any public or official situations, like the way dialects were not really considered, good languages. You couldn't use it at church or in school or with administrators, doctors, and so forth. And there was a lot of misunderstandings between standard speakers and dialect speakers. We did use dialect in theatrical performances in the countryside to depict funny, stupid people and so forth. And that still is there, but other than that, no. And then I have a couple of pictures about the dialects, because I'm at heart dialectologist. And here you have a list of the traditional rural dialects of Swedish in Finland, separated into these main areas that Johanna also mentioned. And then you can sort of, draw isoglosses depending on what you're looking at, the syllable quantity. Johanna mentioned also the tuli, tuuli, tulli, and so forth in Finnish, and we have a lot of variation in that also in the Finland Swedish dialects. And here's just one, whether you say käring or charing and so forth. Here's a general overview of the major differences in the areas. So this is just to show not any details, but just to say that there are quite a lot of differences in the dialects of Swedish spoken in Finland. And I wanted to, here's a place where you can find lots of different dialects, but I wanted to sort of also show you this sort of context with the Finnish dialects and with Finnish or possible contacts, because it's usually not talked about too much. So here is the northern Ostrobothnia area, and in most talking about gender, in most traditional dialects, we have a three-way system, like the masculine, feminine, neuter, just like you have in German. And in standard varieties, there's only two genders, the en and the et. And in these northern Ostrobothnian dialects, you make no gender distinction in, Karleby and Nedervetil, for instance. And of course, in Finnish also, you don't have grammatical gender and you don't have articles and so forth. And these are areas that are very close to the Finnish language dialects. But it's too easy to just say it like that, because in these areas, you have the one gender for indefinite singular and another gender for the definite singular. So they make things more complicated, even though they wouldn't have to, just to indicate that it's not always as easy as it might seem. And also another thing here, that after numbers in standard Swedish, of course, you have a plural marker after numbers. You have, an age group and 15 age groups with the s there. But in these areas, you have singular after number words. So you have just, 15 oldest group, no plural marker here. And of course, in Finnish also, you have singular after numbers. Yes, I know it's partitive and so forth, but still, it's not the plural as you would expect in Swedish in general. And I wanted to say that in the late 1970s, people started not only producing theatrical performances, but songs, and lots of songs in all spheres of life. There were pop songs, there were, even heavy metal things. There were sort of blues songs and in dialect to sort of lift up your own identity and show this is us. And I have some things here that I'm not going to show you here, but since this will be available, you can have a look at Kai, which is one of the most popular sort of pop groups at the moment. So gradually, the Swedish dialects in Finland have really become every Swedish user's property, and it's an important identity factor. You don't have to be a dialect speaker of Swedish in Finland in order to say, oh, Kai, yes, that's us, that's us. So I think it's very interesting change that has taken place. But there are a couple of challenges from the outside, of course, with Finnish. There are, well, in particular, extreme right-wing people who would say that we need to have one people, one country, one language, and Finnish is it. And then you have this inside challenge of, should we do Sweden Swedish or Finland Swedish? Because these are things that are still with us. What is to be the standard of Swedish in Finland? In the late 19th century, this was a huge thing, debate, and especially when Finland was separated from Sweden. And then it was kind of decided, no, we follow Sweden. This is such a small community that we need to sort of have the same language as they have in Sweden in order to be able to, you know, write novels and do whatever media and so forth to be part of that. And today, even, you know, in the last couple of weeks, there are fierce debates in the media, in the Finland Swedish media, but why is Finland Swedish not our standard Swedish? Why do we have to look to the West and to Sweden Swedish? We should abandon them. So this goes on still all the time. And then there's the sort of second thing about contacts with Finnish. There's the debate about the relation between Finnish speakers and Swedish speakers in Finland, that you should really speak Finnish only in Finland. And even last week, there was a sort of big think tank discussion about this, and people had asked, how should we do this? And there are more and more bilingual families today, so that affects things. And there are different language policies at play among the ordinary Finnish people. So we've looked at interviewed people, Finnish speakers, about their views on Swedish and in Finland, and some are very pragmatic, pluralistic, instrumental, use whatever works, language is a tool, money decides. But there are also many people who feel very nationalistic about this and saying things like, no, in Finland you speak Finnish, and if Swedish speakers don't speak Finnish, it's not because they don't know how to, they know it, but they don't want to, they don't like us, and so forth. So this is still going on, which is very weird. We didn't think that this was still the case, but that's an interesting aspect. And when I was interviewing people in Värmland in Sweden, there were some of the people who left in. This is really an interesting case, because you had these people leaving in the 50s from Finland to get jobs in Sweden, and they didn't even have to learn Swedish there, Finnish speakers. They had their tango evenings and so forth. They went out and they felt that they were at home even in the 1950s. But then after a couple of years, when things had gotten better in Finland, they wanted to return, and they tried to, and I have people who said, okay, we went there, but people were so nasty to us, so that we just went back to Sweden. They were really bullied there. So there's something all the time between Finland and Sweden, not only the ice hockey games, but also other things going on still. And I wanted to finish with the sort of contacts and attitudes with English, because Finland has sort of, especially after World War II, been the sort of at some point it was called the community, or the language that the people who wanted to become more American than any other place. And so we investigated these things too, and it's, overtly Finland Swedes also, when you ask them, they're very negative to English words in Swedish nowadays. But when you try to sort of see what goes on underneath what they say, you find that they are extremely positive. I just have some pictures here to show this, that here are people who say that when you ask them, there are too many English words, we shouldn't have that, we should have Swedish words in our Finland Swedish. But then when you sort of ask them, you have a test when you have a job applicants and sort of have people saying exactly the same thing, but one has very few, has a lot of English words and the other one has no English words. You see that if you use a couple of English words, then you're more efficient, you're perceived as much more interesting, even more independent and ambitious. So you're really, the subconscious attitudes are really that you're very positive towards English words, but you don't want to say to anyone that you like English loan words in your Swedish in Finland, Sweden. Okay, so, but basically if you use English words, then you are considered to be more efficient, more interesting, and so forth. So, last slides about the future. Is there a future for Swedish in Finland? Maybe. There's much better relation between Finnish and Swedish speakers now than when I grew up. You couldn't even go to the nearest village because you would, even opening your mouth, you would get hit by, well, your people in your age group because you spoke Swedish. And of course, Swedish is a ticket for Finnish speakers to the job market in Sweden and in Norway, Denmark, and so forth. And it's still a requirement for high-level administrative offices in Finland. So those are the good things. And the Swedish language community, especially the rural communities, are the municipalities that have been very positive towards the refugees, and then youngsters learn Swedish at school when they come to the areas that I talked about, like Ostrobothnia, and the first generation also learns Swedish, and that kind of changes the language landscape from the rural dialectal traditional one. I saw that Marian Kwiatkowski, who's listening here, she's working on these things, one of my PhD students. Does this mean then that we have more Swedish speakers? Many tend to leave for another country, and there are more and more groups of speakers, different sort of multiculturality being developed. So we don't really know. But at universities and in politics and so forth, English is really rapidly taking over the status of being the second language of Finland. At universities, even at the University of Helsinki, which is officially bilingual, Swedish and Finnish, it's very hard to get information in Swedish from from people generally. And well, I have to admit, I myself moved to Sweden, and one of the reasons I have to admit is also the language, but I did it only after I retired. I'm still a Finn at heart. I haven't given up my Finnish passport, but there's a constant fight with the language, or there was when I was in Finland. I mean, I knew Finnish, so that wasn't really a problem. But small things sort of upset me, and I remember one thing that really upset me there was that there were these small Somali young girls who sort of heard me speaking Swedish to my kids, and they started shouting, "Go back to Sweden" in Finnish. And so I thought, oh God, so now they get this idea that Swedes are the bad people and so forth. So I thought, no, I don't want to be part of this. I'm sorry about this. So I moved to Uppsala, and there's no problems with Finland Swedish in Uppsala. My 14-year-old daughter has Finland Swedish, and Sweden Swedish has two separate varieties, so she code switches all the time. And as Johanna also said, many Finland Swedes have emigrated to Sweden, often because of language issues. And it's about 70,000 maybe Finland Swedes in Sweden, plus the 290,000 in Finland. all in all, some 350,000. It's not a million, which it should be in order for it to survive, but it's a pretty good number. So we'll see what happens. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Jan-Ola. That was fascinating. It's just wonderful to get this up to date about what the situations are, about the biggest languages, and not really biggest necessarily perhaps today, but the traditional national languages, Finnish and Swedish in Finland. So thank you for both of you for sharing your expertise. This is just a wonderful treat. So we have some questions, and somebody was asking how many people are in the audience. We had about 150, so that is that's a really good number, and I've been happy to be reading the different places in the chat that we have presented here. So I want to say hi to Ayla, my old-time friend from our mutual language studies at the University of Tampere. Good to see you here, and good to see everybody else. So thank you for being here. So we have some questions for Johanna, and she has already addressed some of these questions to specific people, but there's something Friederike Lucke asked about the consonant gradation in Finnish, because anyone who is learning to speak Finnish, children pick it up, they acquire it without much trouble, but they also struggle in the very beginning. I'm just writing a paper where I'm looking at how a child, a Finnish American child, is acquiring these Finnish, and the acquisition of Finnish morphology. The endings is not the problem. It's that sometimes the consonant gradation provides problems. This is basically when we have katto, katon, matto, matto, maton, but mato, madon, and those kinds of variations. So could you just briefly address that? Where did it come from? Do we know where it came from? Why is Finnish doing that kind of a disservice to all F2, L2 learners of Finnish?
Oh, gradation.
Yes, gradation.
Gradation. So, as Friederike already wrote, it has highly probably it has something to do with the metric or rhythmic structure of the word. And basically, I believe the most simple internal explanation is that originally the consonants between the two syllables were shortened or weakened in some way if the second syllable was longer and heavier, to maintain the contrast between the first stressed and the second unstressed syllable. So if the second syllable was longer and heavier, it had to be shortened in some, and this was done by weakening the consonants in the beginning of it. There was this very popular hypothesis of Lauri Posti in the 1950s that it would have been due to Germanic influence. And it was connected to this idea, which was very, very popular in those times, that the Germanic speakers, so an early Germanic population at a time of when present-day Germanic languages didn't exist yet. So it was an earlier Germanic variety whose speakers lived there in the Eastern Circumbaltic area, and probably they learned to speak Finnic language, Proto-Finnic, so to say, but they spoke it with a Germanic accent, reproducing the so-called Werner's law, which is a sound law in Germanic, which makes certain word internal consonants voiced in certain under certain conditions. And so the Germanic speakers spoke Finnic with a Germanic accent, and the Finnic speakers would have imitated this because the Germanic language variety had something like a prestige. So it was thought that the Germanic speakers lived among the Proto-Finns like some kind of colonial overlords or whatnot. This was a very popular idea for some time, but I'm not disregarding this question about populations and their social relations. Petri Kallio has shown very nicely that actually there are good internal explanations to gradation. You don't need any foreign influences for that.
Great, thank you. I'm sure that everyone who's learning Finnish or using Finnish that they acquired, for instance, here in the US, may have noticed that there is something not strange, but it's and I really like the idea that you demythify Finnish. It is just another language. It does things a little bit differently, and there are other languages that do things differently too. So English does things differently.
Yes. So basically, what I always tell my students here, there is this wonderful quotation by from Roman Jakobson, I think, about how the languages of the world really differ from each other. Actually, all languages of the world can express the same things, because human beings have certain needs they need to communicate, and they are the same for all the people. So, but where the languages differ from each other is not what they cannot express, because all languages can express everything basically, but what they have to express, because languages are constructed differently. And for instance, in languages with a grammatical gender like German, where it is you have to express the gender. If you can't talk about a person without giving away whether it's a he or a she, or if you try to hide it, it becomes very difficult. You can do it, but it costs a lot of effort. In languages like Finnish, you don't have to express it, so this is the real difference. Or in European languages, we have singular and plural. If we think about, if we talk about something, we must express whether it's one of it or many, of it. But there are languages in which there are no singular plural categories in that way. If they can tell there are many things of a certain kind if they need to, but they don't have to if it's not necessary. And so this is the real difference. But well, things like that are usually not taught at school. This is sorry for getting started on it. I could keep preaching about this for ages, but it's really funny that at school, a normal an average Western layperson learns quite a few things about, I don't know, blood circulation or gravity or photosynthesis, how things work in our world, but nothing about what makes languages tick, how languages function and how they develop and how they are related. This what we learn about languages and linguistics at school is usually some certain practical applications of linguistics, like language correctness and spelling and vocabulary and certain things about communicating in certain foreign languages, but nothing about linguistics or language typology in general. And this is, I believe, this is the main problem behind all these prejudices and misconceptions about languages.
It's a good point, thank you. We have a question for Jan-Ola. Are there still Swedish first language speakers who do not manage Finnish, either because they have no use for it or because they have scarce knowledge of Finnish?
Yeah, let me first just say, and to what Johanna just said, that I totally agree. There has to be, basically, we have to insert some linguistics into the secondary school syllabus or something, because language is so important. But yes, there are lots of Swedish speakers who do not know hardly any Finnish. I mean, young people now have to take Finnish at school, but it's very often it's like you learn Finnish the way you learn Latin. You learn the sort of the 15, 16 cases, and you learn them by heart, but you have no way of talking to anybody. So people like my sister's children who are still in the village, they know hardly any Finnish except when they can go and point to places. milk cartons and whatnot if they want to buy milk, but there is still quite a lot of people. And of course, people like my mother is 93 and she doesn't, of course, understand any Finnish. And that's a little bit of a problem if you want to go to the doctors. Can I also say that when somebody asked here if you recognize that you come from Finland if you are in Sweden, and yes, it's not so clear for everyone whether you have Finnish as your L1 as your mother tongue or if you have Swedish as your mother tongue, but people will recognize that, oh, that person is from Finland. But nobody here where I am now in Uppsala will say that, oh, your Swedish is so good, even though you're from Finland. So people, at least here in Uppsala, know that there are two languages or two national languages in Finland. I don't know whether you want, there's so many questions here, but you are the moderator, so I'll
okay, well, thanks for addressing Steve Leppälä's question also. That's if I were to go to Sweden and speak Swedish, they would say, oh, she's a Finland Finn. So there is a difference there.
Well, people don't really know the difference. I mean, there are so many similarities between Finland Swedes and Finland Finns in the melody, in the way they talk. So yes, the ordinary person in the street wouldn't really necessarily know whether you have Finnish or Swedish as your mother tongue, but they do recognize, oh, you're from Finland.
Right, yes. But I would be recognized because of an occasional error in my grammar.
Come on.
So we have a question for Johanna, or both of you actually. This has to do with what variety is taught in schools. Friederike Lücke is asking about the fact that I believe she's taking Finnish lessons. So teachers speak an artificial register close to standard Finnish that is not spoken out of the classroom, and encourage students to go out and speak the same artificial register. And this leads to demotivation of learning, because you're learning a register that is not actually used by actual people on the street. So would you want to comment, either of you, on this one?
Well, actually, I believe teachers of Finnish as a second language, they are much more conscious of the differences between colloquial and standard Finnish, as they were a few decades ago. And as far as I understand, actually colloquial Finnish, or features of colloquial Finnish, are also taught and should be taught to learners of Finnish too. It's just a question in what order they should be taught. Often it's easier to start with the standard language and then proceed to the features of the colloquial language than the other way around, I believe. At least theoretically it's so. I don't know about the practical communicative aspects. And there is also the fact that Finns in general don't tolerate non-native Finnish spoken very well. Finns are not used to the idea of hearing foreigners or non-native speakers speak their language. And this is a usual complaint with students of Finnish at Europe, at least in the German-speaking area. I've heard it numerous times. People go to Finland and nobody will speak Finnish with them. As soon as they spot a foreign accent, they go over, they switch to English. And this is so Finns are not really that used to hearing Finnish spoken by non-natives, and perhaps some teachers think that it would be easier also to start with the standard language, because speaking the standard language gives you some kind of, I don't know, an air of prestige, or at least as an educated and civilized person speaking, perhaps, I don't know. And there is also this, what I found really fascinating. A colleague Heini Lehtonen. She's working at the University of Helsinki as a lecturer of language, believe didactics of Finnish at the moment, but she has done lots of research on the multilingualism of young people of migration background in Helsinki. And she has written somewhere that it seems to be that one central difference between the standard language and the colloquial varieties is the personal pronouns, minä, sinä, I, you, in the standard versus mä, sä, or mä, sä, or something else in the colloquial varieties. And using minä, this formal variant, sounds really very, very formal indeed, but it is typically taught to Finnish learners, and many of these young people of migrant background use this as kind of a foreigner talk marker. So they can use these minä, sinä forms when imitating foreigner talk. For instance, pretending not to understand Finnish very well. This is something like, I not understand Finnish, I not do homework. So they do these things at school, for instance, and in those contexts, they always use this formal variant. So this something like this formal, meaning that this formal standard language forms are developing into something like a foreigner talk marker.
That's fascinating.
Can I just add that we also have to, I'm thinking now, of course, about the Swedish language population, that you have to also, take your matriculation exam, your high school diploma, and that's very often in the Swedish language areas, you don't really, since you don't get in touch with or come in contact with the spoken Finnish, you have to at least be able to produce a good translation or a good essay in Finnish, and there you have to know how to use minä and all these things. And so, but this is really very fascinating, as Johanna said, because this is really why I got into linguistics, I have to say, because I was taught when I learned Finnish that you cannot use things like kin, meaning also on a word. You cannot use any of the kin, pa, han things. You cannot use things like että and kun. You have to sort of rewrite it into participles. You were not allowed to use any of these anything. So when I came out at the age of 18 and found that, oh, but the newspapers are full of kun and että and kin. And so I started sort of getting interested in that. And really, I have to say, because I saw that Fran Karttunen was here, because she they had written a thing about Finnish kin, and I said, oh, this is something really interesting. It's something that I want to get into. That's how I got into pragmatics and stuff like that. This is a personal note, I'm sorry, but it's fascinating, as you say.
That's a great personal note, and if anyone is interested in reading more about that, you can find a book by Jan-Ola about the Finnish discourse particles. Please put it in the resources so people can find it. It's in English, so that's great. We have a question from JB about the percentage of Finns who emigrated to North America, and how many of those people were Swedish speakers. Would you have any hunch about how many? There were that's a totally different, migration studies would be a totally different field, but do you have any hunch of how many of the emigrating Finns were Finland Swedes who moved to North America?
I don't know really, because the thing is that once you got into somebody might, maybe Johanna knows more about this, but I also know that when the Swedish-speaking Finns, Swedish language Finns came to the United States, they would, many of them would try to find a Swedish congregation or hook up with a church that had sermons and stuff in Swedish, and therefore they kind of aligned with the Swedish speakers who came from Sweden there. But I'm sure there must be some numbers that some people have. I'm sorry, I haven't checked that up.
Yeah, the Migration Institute in Turku would have information on that. Yes, and the whole thing about the migration records is that you sometimes have people listed as if people emigrated from Finland before Finland's independence, they may have been listed as Russians, and so it's a bit complicated, but that's a great question. Elsie Kaiser, hi Elsie, is asking Johanna, I was wondering if you know of other non-gender marking languages or dialects that are unrelated to Finnish, that like certain dialects of Finnish that use se as a non-gender marked pronoun as well, can use the same word for both humans and animals and inanimate objects. That's the unique feature of the Finnish se, that it can refer to a human colloquially and to a cat. So do you have a comment on this?
No, I really, I don't know about other languages, languages unrelated to Finnish. I'm not that that well versed in this question, but I would just like to point out that actually the distinction in standard Finnish, that you use hän for human reference and se for animals and inanimates, and then there is always a discussion with or debates with about people who want to call their pets also hän, but that this distinction between or this division of labor between se and hän, it's also one of these artificial features of standard Finnish, and no Finnish dialect, no colloquial form of Finnish has originally made this distinction between human and non-human in this way. It was just something which was artificially introduced into the standard language in the 19th century. And the dialects, usually it's not just about human versus non-human versus non-animate or something like that. With pronouns, usually there are other factors playing here as well, something like, I don't know, definiteness or reference to something mentioned before, or emphasis or reflexivity or whatnot. So there are numerous other factors too, which determine the choice of a pronoun. And it's really quite complicated in Finnish, and I believe in many other languages too.
Thank you. Daniel Haataja, hi Dan, is asking Jan-Ola, this was partially touched upon, but maybe you can elaborate. Can you talk about how Finland's Swedish is perceived in Sweden and the general level of awareness that exists among Swedes about Finland's Swedish?
Yeah,
you kind of touched upon that.
Yes, I talked a little bit about that, and I think you see, recently there has been quite a lot of media stars, almost people like who are very actively involved in on the sort of different chat programs and so forth. I'm thinking about people like Mark Levengood and so forth, who speak a very typical sort of little high standard Finland Swedish that everybody knows, and so it has become really a good thing, and people do recognize, oh, that's Finland Swedish, and even people like Arja Saijonmaa, I don't know, who's of course Finnish speaking, but she speaks almost the same way. So again, I'm going back to that what I said earlier. So people do realize that that you come from Finland once you've lived here for some time. I have a PhD student working on that also in Stockholm or in Uppsala here, and people who have moved it differs, of course. And if you move away from Uppsala and Stockholm and so forth, the further you go, the more difficult it will be for people to realize, or they wouldn't know that, oh, do you speak Swedish in Finland? But here in the coastal areas, everybody in Sweden will know, and it has really high prestige at the moment. It's really a good thing to be a Finland Swede in Sweden.
The Moomin Swedish.
What?
Speaking the Moomin language. as they say.
You mean the movement? Yes, yes.
Yeah.
All these things are. I
There's
just
this cultural
yesterday went to
products which
the.
are,
I went to the Uppsala library, university library, and there's the silver Bible with the Gothic inscriptions in one room. In the room next to it, there's all the Tove Jansson's Moomin books. So they're sort of at the same level. Can I also respond to the next, the anonymous attendee here who asks about Swedish in North America, because there has been quite a lot of studies about that, and there have been two major fieldwork trips, and that they've gone through all the Finland Swedish families that they found. People like Ann-Marie Ivars, Mikael Reuter, and these made a big sort of, Ann-Marie Ivars has just sort of published finally the book that is based on the things that on the trip that they made some 40 years ago. It comes out of SLS, and I'll be happy to give you information about that. So there is a lot of interest, but of course most of them don't speak Swedish anymore, or their kids and so forth. But and nowadays, of course, the interest in heritage languages generally has increased a lot. So if you have, or if you find somebody who speaks Swedish or has some kind of knowledge about Swedish, please go in and interview them and collect material. It's really interesting. We would love to hear about it.
That's great. I love the idea of movements next to the Gothic Bible in Uppsala University. So we have a question from Norm Ford from Suomi, Minnesota. And here in Suomi, Minnesota community, are Finns speaking Finnish from 1900. And there are Finns speaking Finnish from about 1900, the early part of the 20th century, and also what people often refer to as Finglish. Do Finns throughout the world develop similar old Finnish words with local community language? I would say yes, they do.
Yes, of
Any
course.
comments on that?
Yes, of course. And all language communities, of course, always develop their own features. That's typical. And of course, migrants bring their own language with them. But actually, the migration to North America was something special in comparison with other migration waves. Also because I believe it was, I'm not really an expert, but I believe it was regionally perhaps a little bit more restricted. Most of those people who came to North America in the late 19th and early 20th century, they came from Western Finland, Ostrobothnia in particular, quite a few people from my extended family too, and they spoke basically the same dialect, and they formed traditional migrant communities. Nowadays, it's already with a great emigration to Sweden in the 1960s and 70s already. It was a migration which came from, people came from really many different parts from Finland, speaking different Finnish varieties already in the beginning. So the internal differences, I believe, were greater. And today, of course, today's expatriate Finns, today's emigration is usually individual. People leave Finland for private reasons, to study, to work, or because of a significant other. And I believe also that their contact to the Finnish language nowadays is different than it was 100 years ago. So I don't think that such migrant communities with speaking special varieties of Finnish, I don't know if such communities can develop in today's conditions anymore, but I haven't really done any research in this matter, and I would love to hear somebody more knowledgeable elaborate on this.
Well, that's a really good point, and we don't have. It's because I think the reason that people who emigrate from Finland, especially to North America today, they know English and they don't have this. They also very often they struggle to keep the languages separate, even though code switching, translanguaging is the most normal thing bilinguals do. We have a question for Jan-Ola. This is kind of like a discussion question from Lori. I think I know who you are. I only recently became aware of the preference of Finland Swedes for this name that you brought up on the slides. Of course, one should always use the name the people in the group prefer, but I had previously preferred to use Swedish-speaking Finns. To me, it's a bit strange to use the term Swedes for this group, although we of course use suomenruotsalaiset in Finnish, but Jan-Ola also said he's a Finn at heart. So this reminds me of the popular Swedish song that goes, "Är jag svensk eller finne?" Do you yourself feel, personal question, do you yourself feel any duality here?
Oh yes. First of all, let me just say that I wanted to point out the idea of talking about Swedish language Finns, because I've been working quite a lot with the sign language community and tried to sort of, up them and boost their sort of right to have a right to their own language. That's why I tend to talk about Swedish language Finns. But I don't know, the Finland Swede, you don't have to, I don't know, it's not tied to language as such, and I don't know why it has become that way. I agree, I don't know whether this is Ritva or who's asked the question, but I agree, and yes, you are right, it's a little bit of a problem, but this is the way we want it to be. As for my duality, yes, that is a problem. Now we've had the Olympics, and even though I love Niskanen, his gold medal and so forth, but I do have to admit that Sweden has now taken 17 medals and Finland only like 4 or 5, and so you feel a little bit proud also of the Swedes, and yeah, it's problematic. I've only lived here in Sweden now for 5 years or so, and I still go back to Finland and spend several months there. So it is, yes, I feel duality, a lot of duality there, but I don't see why I have to choose really. And maybe I don't know. No, it's difficult to say why it has become tradition to talk about Finland Swede, but that's the term we used, and all Finland Swedes use it, so yeah. There is also another question, if I can just take that at the same time, because I can't really respond to it. The question is whether from Andrei Stekko about that in Oulu there's very few people speak Swedish, and it's not popular at all there, but that I don't know why people don't speak Swedish in Oulu, in Uleåborg. There are possibilities and so forth there, but the reason why, of course, Vasa is it's not the fact that there's a lot of Swedish around the Vasa area is also because it's so close to the Kvarken, the Merenkurkku, I don't know what it's in English, the place. I mean, it's very easy to go from Umeå to Vasa, and in the old days, even when I was young, you used to drive by car over the ice because it was just opened up for people to do that. So, and then there's always been a lot of contact that way, and we've also when I'm in Ostrobothnia, we get access to the there's a TV and radio station, or sort of mast, I don't know what it's called, that sends programs from Sweden in Sundsvall, and we could pick them up. So we watched Swedish TV and listened to Swedish radio all the time. So maybe that's the reason why it's so, there's so much more Swedish in Vasa. I don't know about Oulu.
May I add something to this, because
yes.
Of course, the traditional answer would be that Vasa is part of the traditional Swedish-speaking area. It's part of Svensk Finland. It's surrounded by Swedish-speaking areas, and Oulu is not. Oulu is surrounded by totally Finnish-speaking countryside, and it is not part of the traditional Swedish area, so to say. But then it's more complicated. I was just so fascinated to read in the Hufvudstadsbladet a few days ago. There was a story about a Swedish school class in Hämeenlinna, Tavastehus, which is a town in southern Finnish inland, completely Finnish speaking. I spent my childhood there. I didn't know anybody who spoke Swedish. I never heard a word of Swedish there. And of course, I knew that there had been some old people there, because it was the capital of the county, and there was some local administration there and authorities. And even in the beginning of the 20th century, these were Swedish speakers. There was a Swedish language school in Hämeenlinna in the 1920s and so on. But in my times, my God, I never knew that there about anything Swedish speaking there. And I was really amazed in my childhood when I saw in the local newspaper that the local church had one service in Swedish every Christmas. A church service in Swedish, for whom? Other Swedish speakers here? Never heard anything. And now I read, a few days ago, I read in the Hufvudstadsbladet that they have a Swedish-speaking school class there. Or actually starting from kindergarten, a few activists have brought it about, and now it's continuing. And there is really a group of kids who continue speaking Swedish there and learning Swedish. And actually, it is so that this tradition of these Swedish language islands, all major cities and towns in Finland did have this upper middle class and upper class speaking Swedish. Of course, in smaller towns, it was a very small group, but it did exist. And so it seems that this continuity of Swedish in these language islands in the Finnish inland is still there, and it's alive. And it was also a very nice reminder of what we know about minority language studies in general, that minorities can become almost invisible. They are there, but other people just don't even know that they exist.
That's fascinating. Jan-Ola, do you want to comment on that one?
No, I agree. I mean, there are also, it has to do with factories and things. I'm thinking of Kuusankoski and Kouvola and so forth, that you have the paper industry and so forth, and then people moved over there, and because there was enough of them, you had to have a Swedish language school and so forth. But yes, it is. I totally agree. And there have been the PhD's work on Sophie Henriksson has written about the language islands and the status in these difference. Can I respond to the question from Pauline R about what variety of Swedish do native Finnish speakers learn at school? Because this is really a big issue. Traditionally, it has always been Finland Swedish, and I'm not really sure whether that has changed, but I know that people from eastern parts of Finland, or from any part except the areas around where Swedish speakers live in Finland, they would like to learn Swedish, and I know also that, for instance, in Jyväskylä and Joensuu, I think at the universities there, they do nowadays use Swedish much more than Finland Swedish. But it is one of those debatable questions of whether because the people who live inland in Finland, they hardly ever have anything to do with the Swedish speakers in Finland. but they do sometimes go over to Sweden and, enjoy life there. So, and then I'll just respond also to the question of if I know how many native signers of Finland Swedish Sign Language there are. Yes, I do. Unfortunately, there is less than 100 at the moment, and I could go on about this and give you more specific information if you're interested, but it is a language that is, it has been sort of established now as a separate language than Finnish Sign Language and then Swedish Sign Language and so forth. But there's only, the last time we did it, about, 80 or so people who can honestly say that Finland Swedish Sign Language is their mother tongue. Sorry for talking so much, but these are exciting questions.
This is fascinating. This is going very smoothly. We're covering a lot of ground here, and again, because we will be asking you to provide some kind of a short bibliography of your topics, so for FinFest. So that's a good place to put some resources about those numbers, which we can't cover everything, but here's where you can go and learn more about it. I'm going to address the question from Norm Ford from Suomi, Minnesota. He has a question about the selection. This ties together with what variety of language is taught in schools. This is always a kind of like a power question, register related question, because language varies. We have this language Swedish, and there's multiple varieties, and Finnish the same way. It has multiple dialects, it has multiple registers, and then what is going to be chosen to be taught for people is a tough question in a way. Very often it's the same thing as which variety of English is taught for language learners of English. Is it British English? Is it American English? Is it any other variety of English that are so-called non-standard varieties of English? Why are they not taught in school? But we have, fortunately, among our audience, we have Daniel Haataja, who actually teaches Finnish at the University of Minnesota. And as a reply, I will read Daniel's reply. I believe this is the case. Wait a minute. Okay. And we teach both written and spoken Finnish. So there's a register difference there. Written and spoken Finnish in tandem right from the start. Dan believes that this is the case in most universities abroad. The key is to teach students to use the written and spoken languages for different purposes. Students write essays using the written language, but practice writing text messages to a friend using the spoken language. We also encourage students to use spoken language in the classroom. So these practices have also changed, I believe that, and thank you very much, Daniel, for your expert answer here. We have other question here. And I think this might be a perfect question to end the panel, unless we want to have some additional comments still. This is from Anonymous. How is the language in the Kalevala seen today? It is a creative way to use language. Is it a creative way to use a language, and it tells happenings clearly and honestly? So it's a creative way to use language, and yeah, absolutely, we agree. But how do Finns today perceive the language of the Kalevala? I said this is a great question because it's February and the Kalevala Day is coming up.
This is a great question also because Helka Rionheimo will probably talk about these things too next week, because actually the language of the Kalevala The Kalevala is compiled of North Karelian folk poetry, and the original texts were actually not Finnish. They were Northern or White Sea Karelian, which is nowadays considered a separate language. And this is also a question of, so to say, cultural imperialism. For a long time, it was thought that Karelian is just a dialect of Finnish, and especially these northern dialects, which are really very close to Finnish, that they belong to the Finnish language. And this Karelian folk poetry was taken and used by the Finn Elias Lönnrot to compile the epic Kalevala. And Lönnrot did some editing on the language, so he very carefully Finnicized the language to some extent. So it represents something like a Finnicized version of the original Karelian language. And I don't know, I believe the older generations in Finland, they probably don't see it this way. They have been taught that, okay, this is Finnish, this is traditional Finnish folk poetry, and this is a beautiful poetic Finnish language, okay, which is, of course, it's true. And Lönnrot was really, he was a masterful user of this poetic language. He had learned to use it really in an excellent way. And if you doubt on this, please read Kalevipoeg and then come back to me, the Estonian folk epic, which you only after, sorry all Estonians if you are listening, but only after that did I really start appreciating Kalevala. So, what probably you will hear more about this next week from Helka Rionheimo, but now as Karelian as a minority language has been acknowledged in Finland too, and there are also young activists who are really working to revitalize Karelian in Finland and to raise its status. And Kalevala is discussed in this context, actually, really quite intensely, but what the Finns did to our Kalevala and what we can do, so to say, to retrieve it.
Thank you. That's great. So I want to thank everybody. I want to thank especially the panelists for giving up your time and coming here to share your knowledge and spread the word about what languages are spoken in Finland today. As Johanna mentioned, we will have another panel number 2, Multilingual Finland, coming up next week, and we will have 4 speakers, all of them experts in the fields, as Johanna and Jan-Ola. And you will hear about Karelian, Russian, Estonian in Finland today, some more myth-busting talks, the language of the Finnish Roma, Romani, Sami, of course, we'll start with a presentation on Sami, and then the newest, most recently entered languages, or as perceived as the most recently entered languages, African languages. So, so we'll have an interesting session a week from today. And I want to thank both panelists, Jan-Ola and Johanna. Thank you so much. And we hope,
thank you for having us. It was great.
Thank you. To get that resource list, you can send it to me and I'll send it to be posted. It doesn't have to be long, but we have had a lot of references to much more reading where people can learn about these topics more. And
thank you, Helena, for organizing this and Lotta and so forth. This has been really great and a lot of really interesting questions and things also that I've learned that I didn't know. I saw in particular Marianne Vargelin had said something about Swedish-speaking Finns not being welcome in the Swedish communities there, and things that needs to be looked into, because I thought they were. I mean, but it's really been a really interesting discussion and lots of new information and data also that I have received. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, and thank you for participating with your questions. Thank you for being part of this audience. We still have a lot of people present here. This is a little bit longer than what we normally have had, but thanks for staying. Thanks for coming to visit the panel. That was wonderful. Thank you, audience. Thank you, presenters. Without the audience, we would not have an event. See you in a week. Have a wonderful rest of this Saturday. Yep. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.